adapt to different user profiles. In this video, you will learn the difference between static and dynamic content. You will also be able to differentiate between the role of a web server and an application server. By now, you know that when you open a website, a web server sends the website's content to your browser. By now, you know that when you open a website, a web server sends the website's content to your browser. The content can be static or dynamic. Static content is files that the server transfers just as they are stored on the web server, such as videos or images. Dynamic content, on the other hand, is generated when the HTTP request is made. For example, the content may be generated based on input from a user, or when you visit a news website, it would be based on the current date. What actually happens is that the web server communicates with another kind of server, called an application server or a backend. The application server generates the dynamic content that the web server sends back to the user's browser. Now you know the difference, let's look at examples of how websites update static and dynamic content. Say, for instance, you want to watch a video on a website. You click on the play button and a request is sent to the web server. The web server responds by sending the file to your browser. Now, how does this The web server responds. You click on the play button and a request is sent to the web server. The web server responds by sending the file to your browser. Now, how does this compare to dynamic content? Because dynamic content is generated while you use a website, it typically takes longer to generate than it takes to send back static content. For example, when you log into this course, the web server communicates with an application server to check that you are in fact enrolled. The application server confirms your enrollment and specifies what content should show for your profile specifically. Application servers perform more complex processing than web servers. For instance, they have to run application logic, communicate with a database, and check permissions. To improve performance, different application servers have specific purposes. There are application servers for every type of content out there, from music streaming to creating your own blog. You can even create your own application servers, such as building a backend for a web application. But hang on, if dynamic content is slower to generate, isn't that a problem for big websites? Yes, it is. Application servers typically have a limited capacity on how many requests they can process per second. Generate. Isn't that a problem for big websites? Yes, it is. Application servers typically have a limited capacity on how many requests they can process per second. But fortunately, this is where the web server can help out. Web servers use a process called caching. Instead of generating content dynamically for every request, servers use a process called caching. Instead of generating content dynamically for every request. Caching means the web server keeps a copy of dynamic content. If the content is requested again, the web server can immediately send this cached version instead of passing the request again to the process. It's called caching. Instead of generating content dynamically for every request. Caching means the web server I'm sure you've noticed that when you shop online, sending the file to your browser. Application logic, application servers have there. From music streaming to creating your own blog. You can even create your own application servers, such as building a backend for a web application. But hang on, if dynamic content is slower to generate, isn't that a problem for big websites? Yes, it is. Application servers typically have a limited capacity on how many requests they can process per second. But fortunately, this is where the web server can help out. Web servers use a process called caching instead of generating content dynamically for every request. Caching means the web server keeps a copy of dynamic content. If the content is requested again, the web server can immediately send this cached version instead of passing the request again to the application server. On the first request for dynamic content, the web server checks if the content exists in the cache. If it does not exist, the content is requested from the application server and stored in the cache. The web server then sends back the dynamic content to the browser. On subsequent requests, the web server immediately sends back the content stored in the cache. This reduces the amount of dynamic content that the application server has to generate. Then, after a period of time or with the next user interaction, the web server updates the cache with the latest content. Now you know the difference between static and dynamic content, as well as the difference between web and application servers. With this new information, try to identify whether the content on the websites you visit is static or dynamic.
Hiểu rồi đó.
Let's say that you're thinking of building a web app. You probably want a user-friendly, mobile-friendly experience. Then you should consider using single-page applications or SPAs to build a unique, speedy, and engaging experience for your users. You're probably using a unique, speedy, and engaging engaging experience for your users. You're probably using many SPAs every day. Think of your favorite social network. You're probably using many experience that let's say that you're thinking of building a web app. You probably want a user-friendly, mobile-friendly experience. Then you should consider using single-page applications or SPAs to build a unique, speedy, and engaging experience for your users. You're probably using many SPAs every day. Think of your favorite social network or messaging app, or the map application you use to find local businesses. The great user experience you get is driven by single-page applications. So, what exactly is an SPA? How does it work? How is it different from a traditional website? Let's first explore how a traditional website works. Before the advent of modern JavaScript frameworks, most websites were implemented as multi-page applications. But this makes traditional applications resource-intensive to web servers, because sending entire web pages for every request consumes excessive bandwidth and uses because sending entire web pages for every request consumes excessive bandwidth and uses CPU time to generate dynamic pages. If your website is complex, the site browsing experience may appear slow to users. It will be even slower if they have a poor or limited internet connection. To solve this problem, many web developers build their web applications as SPAs. It's called single page, but that doesn't mean your website has only one page of content. What it means is that there is only one HTML page that gets sent from the server to the browser. But that page will update its content as your users interact with your website. A SPA allows the user to interact with the website without the application. A SPA allows the user to interact with the website without the application needing to download entire new web pages. Instead, it rewrites the current web page as the user interacts with it. The result is a browsing experience that feels fast. Faster and more responsive to user input. The result is a browsing experience that feels faster and more responsive to user input. When the user navigates to the web application in the browser, the web server returns the necessary resources to run the application. A SPA has two approaches to serving code and resources. The first is called bundling, and the second approach is known as lazy loading or code splitting. With bundling, when the browser requests the application, the server returns and loads all necessary HTML, CSS, and JavaScript immediately. With lazy loading, the browser requests the application, and the server returns only the minimum HTML, CSS, and JavaScript needed to load the application. Additional resources are downloaded as required. For example, when a user navigates a specific section of the application. Both approaches are valid. The choice depends on the size, complexity, and bandwidth requirements of the application. For instance, with the bundling approach, if your application is complex and has a lot of resources, your bundles will grow quite large and take a long time to download. You could end up with a site that is slower than a traditional web application. Let's explore an example. Imagine you have a site dedicated to reviewing movies. People never know what to watch next. So you decide to install a feature that randomly suggests the movie for a user. You create a web page that has a What to Watch Next button. You want to display a random movie name when the button is clicked. In a traditional website, when the button is clicked, the browser will send a post request to the web server. The web server returns a new web page containing the button and movie name. The web browser then renders the new page. In an SPA, when the button is clicked, the browser will send a post request to the web server. The web server will return a JSON object. The application reads the object and updates by displaying the text of the movie name. That's more efficient because the rest of the page remains as it was, and its content does not need to be sent by the server and rendered by the browser. But what if you need to update the majority of the page to display a different form of content? Well, let's explore that scenario. Suppose you are building a web application that has 2 pages. One page shows the latest news, and the other page shows the current user's profile page. A navigation bar at the top of the site contains a link to each page. In a traditional website, when the user clicks the profile link, the web browser sends the request to the web server. The web server generates the entire HTML page and sends it back to the web browser. The web browser then renders a new web page. In a single-page application, different pages are broken into templates, also known as views. Each view will have HTML code that can be updated by the application. For instance, the profile page would have a username, a first name, and a last name. The web browser sends the request to the web server, and the web server sends back a file called a JavaScript Object Notation, or JSON object. This contains only the data to be displayed, such as a user's first name and last name, and the SPA will update the HTML. This is much smaller than sending an entire web page. The web browser then updates the web page by inserting the template with items replaced by the values in the JSON object. For your next website, consider whether its complexity suits a traditional multi-page application or would perform better as an SPA. Remember that a single-page application has 2 methods of delivering resources: delivering all resources immediately or delivering resources dynamically as required. If all resources are delivered when the application is loaded, the single-page application must include the views for every page on initial load. If resources are loaded dynamically, the single-page application requests the views as required and stores views in the browser for subsequent requests. Loaded, this dynamically as required. Must include the views for every page on initial load. Loaded, the single-page application. If all resources are delivered when the application is loaded, the single-page application must include the views for every page on initial load. If resources are loaded dynamically, the single-page application requests the views as required and stores views in the browser for subsequent requests. Now you can compare some popular SPA websites to traditional ones and judge the performance difference for yourself. I'm sure you've created something from scratch before. I bet you realized how challenging it can be as opposed to using pre-made components. Think about the effort that goes into building a brand new house versus the convenience of constructing a modular building with pre-made components that you just need to put together. React is focused on working with components, which makes it simple to build functional user interfaces on web and mobile. And since React is one of the most popular JavaScript libraries, it's important that you can explain what its purpose is and describe how its components work together. Available since 2013, React is an open source library with a community of core contributors and companies that maintain it. Developers use React to develop single-page applications, and you can also develop mobile applications with React Native. When you develop an app, you can choose to use React to develop the user interface, but building an application requires more than that. Use React.
What is caching? In caching, copies of files are saved in a temporary storage location, known as a cache, for quick and easy retrieval. In the context of a content delivery network, or CDN, a website's files are cached onto a distributed set of CDN servers. Imagine a user in Tokyo trying to access a website hosted in Los Angeles. The user's request will have to travel over 5,000 miles to reach the web server, and the response will have to cover the same distance. That can take a long time. A globally distributed CDN can cache the website's files in CDN servers around the world. This way, when a user in Tokyo wants to access a website 5,000 miles away, they can minimize latency by getting the files from a CDN server close to them.
single page application. Single page application is a website or web application that dynamically rewrites the current web page. With new data from the web server instead of the default method of the web server load entire new page. biệt hay nha.
To develop the user interface, but building an application requires more than that. You must also consider using it with React to develop single-page applications, and you can also develop mobile applications with React Native. When you develop an app, you can choose to use React to develop the user interface, but building an application requires more than that. You must also consider the navigation and how the app will request data from a web server. Therefore, React is used in conjunction with other JavaScript libraries during development. But what makes React so useful is that it allows developers to write less code to create functionality. This in turn makes it easier to maintain code in the long term and simplifies testing. Because it is so central to front-end development, there are many tools that you can use with React. These tools can help you understand how React is running your code and how you can improve performance. Now that you have a better idea of what React is, let me tell you more about React's components. The key concept behind React is that it allows you to define components that you can combine to build a web application. A component is basically a small piece of user interface, such as a music player or photo gallery. This component model allows you to do several things, such as developing and testing parts of their application in isolation, and it also allows you to reuse components across multiple sections of the application as well. Let's explore an example. Most web applications have user profiles with pictures. Normally, several parts of the application use a version of this profile picture, such as in the navigation bar beside the user's name. It could also show in a user search result along with several other user pictures. And the user picture might also display in instant message notifications. Instead of programming the logic for every instance of a user profile picture, React allows you to create a user icon component that displays a version of a profile picture every time it is used. You can then reuse this component throughout the application, a profile picture every time it is used. You can then reuse this component throughout the application. Can you imagine how it will improve your efficiency? Throughout the application. Can you imagine how it will improve your efficiency? There are, in fact, many open source libraries that provide pre-made components for React projects. For example, if you want to add a video player to your website, there's a React component library for that. Or maybe you want to embed a map. There's a React component library for that too. As the React community grows bigger, it continues to add new features and improvements continuously. Annual React conferences encourage community sharing and introduce upcoming developments in the library.
You're developing a single page or single page application. Why it is very difficult to use React during your development. Choose all that apply from the list below. Right, let's go in development. Yes, maintain code in long term. Yes, simplify testing code and reduce component.
I hope that in the near future, you might be joining the React community as an active member. And, as a future React community member, you now know the React library's purpose and how its components work together to make life easier for front-end developers. After all, why build something from scratch if the components are already there to use?
Case study. Why did Facebook engineers create React? There are a lot of JavaScript model control view and model view controller MVC frameworks out there. Why did we build React and why we want to use it? React isn't an MVC framework. React is a library for building composable user interface.
Encourages
the creation of reusable UI components with recent data exchange over